If you haven't seen part 1 yet, I'd recommend watching that first. I'll have it linked below. In part 1, I talked about how racism shaped things like housing, jobs, schools, and generational wealth in America. Basically, the parts of racism that are easier to see when you're looking at laws and government policies. But laws are only part of how people learn what to believe about each other. People also learn from what they watch, and that's what I want to talk about in this video. Because when we look back at old American entertainment, there's this tendency to separate it from whatever was happening in the country at the time. You'll see something racist in an old movie and somebody will say, well, that was just the comedy back then. Or you'll bring up an old cartoon in here, it was a different time. Which, yeah, it was a different time. That's kind of the point. What was happening during that time? Who had rights? Who didn't? What were Americans being told about black people outside the theater? And then what were they paying inside to see of it? Because some of this stuff was everywhere. And once you actually follow where these characters and stereotypes came from, you start seeing the same ideas pop up in places that seem completely unrelated today. Cartoons, clowns and circus entertainment, Disney, Aunt Jemima, even songs people still know. A lot of people grew up around pieces of this history without even being told where any of it came from. I did too. So let's go back to one of the biggest parts of that story. Blackface. And when I say blackface, I'm talking about an actual entertainment industry. Go back to New York in the 1830s. One of the biggest names associated with early blackface minstrelsy was Thomas Dartmouth Rice. Rice was obviously white, and he became famous performing a character called Jim Crow. Before most of us even heard those words in history class talking about segregation, Americans knew Jim Crow as a character. Rice would darken his face, perform exaggerated versions of black speech and movement, sing, dance, and basically turn his idea of a black man into entertainment for white audiences, and the character blew up. Jim Crow became so well known that the name eventually became a racial insult. Later, it became associated with the entire system of segregation that developed after Reconstruction. When you hear Jim Crow laws, there's a direct line backwards to a white guy on stage performing a racist character. Minstrel shows became massive in the United States. By the middle of the 1800s, this was mainstream entertainment. People bought tickets, companies toured, there were advertisements and posters. White performers would darken their faces with burnt cork or other materials and perform these exaggerated black characters. The characters varied, but you keep seeing the same ideas come back. Black people were stupid, lazy, they couldn't control themselves, but they were perfectly happy serving white people. And people laughed at this for decades. Think about the environment these shows existed in. If you were a white American in the 1800s, there's a good chance you weren't regularly interacting with black Americans as equals. For a huge portion of the century, slavery existed. Even after emancipation, segregation and racial discrimination kept black and white Americans separated in huge parts of everyday life. Schools were separated, public spaces were separated, black Americans were being prevented from voting in much of the South. So for some white Americans, entertainment was helping fill in the blanks. They might barely know black people personally, but they knew these characters. They knew Jim Crow. They knew the lazy characters. They knew the exaggerated accents. And if they see the same type of person portrayed the same way over and over again, eventually some of that's starting to feel familiar. That's why I think people underestimate entertainment. Nobody has to stand in front of you and say, here's what you should believe about black people. You can learn an association through a joke. If the stupid character keeps looking a certain way, that does something. If the lazy character keeps speaking a certain way, that does something too. And once audiences understand the stereotypes, you can start changing what it looks like. That's where this history starts spreading into other forms of American entertainment. Take clowns. Obviously, clown-like performers and gestures existed long before American minstrelsy. What I'm interested in is what happened to this kind of entertainment in America. Minstrelsy, circus performance, and eventually film were developed around each other. Performers borrowed things, audiences became familiar with certain types of physical comedy and exaggerated characters. And blackface attached race to a lot of those exaggerations. Look at old minstrel imagery. The exaggerated mouth is hard to miss. Your facial expressions are huge. You have oversized clothing, exaggerated movements, and performers acting ridiculous because that's where the laugh is supposed to come from. Except now the person being made ridiculous is specifically supposed to represent a black person. That's what gave those performances another purpose in American culture. People were laughing at a racial character. Then entertainment changed. Movies show up, animation showed up, and some of that visual language comes with it. This is where early cartoons get really interesting. Mickey Mouse, Felix the Cat, Bosco. Don't focus up on one glove or one pair of shoes and decide that proves everything. Watch how the character actually performs. The movement and expressions, the way the bodies bend around, the way they dance. A lot of this animation was being created by people who grew up in an entertainment culture where minstrelsy were still familiar. There's actually a whole area of scholarship around this. Nicholas Salmon wrote a book called Birth of an Industry, Blackface Minstrelsy and the Rise of American Animation. He traces how closely early American animation developed alongside the performance traditions that come before it. And there are examples where the connection is extremely obvious. Disney's Mickle melodrama came out in 1933. The cartoon has Mickey and other characters putting on a production of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it uses blackface imagery. That's Disney. Which brings us into another part of this history that I think a lot of people have seen without really knowing what they're looking at. Dumbo. Disney released Dumbo in 1941. If you've seen it, you probably remember the Crows. The leader of the Crows was identified in production material as Jim Crow. Think about that year for a second. Jim Crow segregation was still happening. This wasn't some ancient reference whose meaning had disappeared. Black Americans were living under Jim Crow while Dumbo was playing in theaters. Then Disney releases Song of the South in 1946. In 1946 gives you a much better idea of why that movie became so controversial than simply saying, it's an old Disney movie. Jackie Robinson joined the Brooklyn Dodgers the next year. Brown versus Board of Education wouldn't happen until 1954. Rosa Parks was still almost a decade away from refusing to give up her seat in Montgomery. That's the America watching Song of the South. When the movie represents this warm, nostalgic version of the South, you have to remember what's happening outside the movie theater. Actual Black Americans were still fighting segregation. That's what I mean when I say entertainment and politics can't always be separated as cleanly as we like to separate them. These movies were being made while all of this was happening. And Disney was far from the only studio doing it. Warner Bros. Had racial characters, MGM had them, Fleischer Studios had them. Go through American cartoons from the 1920s through the 1940s, and some of the stuff is incredibly blatant. And kids were watching it. A 5-year-old doesn't know who Thomas Rice is. They're not sitting there thinking about Reconstruction or minstrel theater. They're watching a cartoon. They're laughing because something looks funny. But kids still pick up patterns. They learn which characters are supposed to look stupid. They learn what villains sound like. They learn what's considered beautiful or ugly before they could even explain any of that to you. And if some of the stereotypes keep appearing across movies, cartoons, advertisements, and everything else around them, those ideas start becoming a normal part of their culture. Advertising gives us one of the clearest examples of this. Aunt Jemima. I remember Aunt Jemima as syrup. That's probably how most people around my age remember it. You walk through the grocery store and there's a smiling black woman on a bottle. It doesn't feel like you're looking at some artifact from the 19th century racism. You're trying to buy pancake syrup. But go backward. The Aunt Jemima character was connected to the minstrel song Old Aunt Jemima. That song was performed in blackface, and the character itself drew from the mammy stereotype. The mammy was this image of a black domestic servant who was completely devoted to a white family. Usually she's smiling. She's nurturing. She seems perfectly happy taking care of everybody. And that image becomes really useful when America starts looking backwards at slavery. Because enslaved black women actually were forced to perform domestic labor for white families. They cooked, cleaned, cared for white families while sometimes being separated from their own families. There was violence behind that relationship. The mammy character softens it. Now the black servant loves taking care of the white family. She's happy. Everybody gets along. And eventually that image is selling pancake mix. That's such a strange path when you actually follow it from beginning to end. You start with a racial stereotype connected to black servitude. It goes through minstrel entertainment. Then a version of that character ends up in American kitchens for generations. By the time I saw Aunt Jemima, none of that history was obvious. It was syrup. This is a perfect example of racism laundering. The original meaning gets harder to see as something gets repackaged over time. People forget the minstrel shows. They remember the mascot. Another generation comes along and doesn't even know there was a minstrel show in the first place. But when the company finally changes the branding, somebody looks at the bottle and goes, seriously? We're offended by syrup now? From their perspective, I kinda understand why they're confused. They're entering the story at the very end. They saw Aunt Jemima at breakfast. They didn't see the 100 years of imagery that came before the breakfast table. And I think that's a much more useful way to have these conversations than assuming everybody already knows its history. Most people don't. I didn't grow up knowing all of it either. You learn something you've seen your entire life has this whole history behind it, and suddenly you're looking at the same thing differently. Which brings me to probably the most predictable response whenever blackface comes up. What about white chicks? Every time. White Chicks came out in 2004. Keenan Ivory Wayans directed it. Sean and Marlon Wayans play two black FBI agents disguising themselves as wealthy white women. And yes, obviously they're changing their skin color and exaggerating women they're pretending to be. But when people compare that directly to blackface, they're usually comparing their makeup and stopping there. Go back through everything we just talked about. Thomas Rice was performing Jim Crow in the 1830s. Minstrel companies were touring America. Black people were being portrayed as stupid and lazy while actual black Americans were enslaved. Those stereotypes continued after emancipation while black Americans were still being denied equal rights. Then pieces of those characters showed up in advertising and film. That's the history attached to blackface. White Chicks doesn't have that history behind it. There wasn't a whiteface entertainment industry that spent generations portraying white Americans as an inferior race. There wasn't a whiteface character whose name eventually became associated with laws segregating white Americans. That's why looking at the makeup alone doesn't tell you very much. Context changes what an image means. The blackface character existed inside a society that was already arguing black people were inferior. Entertainment gave people a funny version of the same idea, and those stereotypes could become explanations for what people saw around them. If black Americans were disproportionately poor because they had been excluded from opportunities, the stereotype already had an easier answer. They're lazy. If black Americans were denied education, the stereotype could just say that they were naturally ignorant. You don't have to talk about discrimination if you've already decided the outcome says something about the person. That's part of what made these characters useful. They gave inequality a story, and American entertainment has another weird relationship with black culture that shows up throughout this period. Because while black people were being mocked, black culture was also being copied constantly. Puttin' on the Ritz is another really interesting example. Most people know the song in some form. Maybe you know Fred Astaire. Maybe you know the scene from Young Frankenstein. Some people probably know the taco version from the 1980s. The joke was basically that these were poor black people dressing like they were wealthy. The original lyrics talk about them wearing expensive looking clothes, spending every dime that they had, even spending their last 2 bits while putting on the Ritz. Black Americans had been shut out of huge parts of the American economy. Discrimination affected where people could work, what they were paid, where they could live, and which financial institutions would serve them. Black communities even built their own banks, partly because mainstream institutions often discriminated against them. So the image of a black person with money already existed inside a country where black wealth was heavily restricted. Then the Great Depression hits, and black Americans were hit incredibly hard. They were already dealing with discrimination before the economy collapsed, and when jobs disappeared, black workers were often among the first pushed out of employment. We wouldn't look at this song as some harmless joke about people dressing fancy. Look at who the joke is about. Black people who had far fewer opportunities to build wealth are being mocked for dressing like they have it. And Harlem meant something very specific at that time. This was around the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes was writing, Duke Ellington was building his career, black artists and musicians were having an enormous influence on American culture, so Lenox Avenue wasn't a meaningless location to throw into the song. Then Berlin later rewrote lyrics for Fred Astaire. Lenox Avenue became Park Avenue. The song kept going. The Harlem reference didn't. Think about how many people have heard Puttin' on the Ritz since then, and have absolutely no idea that an earlier version was connected to Harlem. That's how easily context disappears. And this was happening while America had this really strange relationship with black culture. White Americans could love black music while black musicians were dealing with segregation. They could imitate black dancing on stage, and then walk outside into a city where black residents couldn't live in a certain neighborhood. There were theaters where black performers could entertain white audiences while black customers faced restrictions inside the same entertainment world. That's such a bizarre contradiction when you look at it now. But people lived inside that contradiction for generations. That's why I keep coming back to the dates. Dumbo comes out in 1941, Song of the South 1946, Jackie Robinson joins the Dodgers in 47, Brown vs. Board happens in 54, Rosa Parks was arrested in Montgomery in 1955. When you learn these things separately in school, they feel like different chapters. Disney is entertainment history, Jackie Robinson is sports history, Brown is legal history, but these people were alive at the same time. These things were happening at the same time. Somebody could go see one of these movies and then walk outside into a segregated city. A kid could watch a racist cartoon and then go to a segregated school. A family could have Aunt Jemima sitting on their breakfast table while watching the civil rights movement on television. Once you put everything back into the same timeline, the history feels a lot less distant. Then time passes. That's where nostalgia gets involved. And nostalgia makes this conversation really difficult because people don't experience an old cartoon as a historical document. They remember sitting on the floor watching it as a kid. They remember their grandparents eating a bowl of cereal on a Saturday morning. So when somebody says, hey, there's actually some racist history behind this, it can feel weirdly personal. Like somebody is accusing you of something because you liked a cartoon when you were 7. That's obviously not what I'm saying. A kid watching Dumbo didn't create Jim Crow. Someone buying Aunt Jemima syrup in 1995 probably wasn't thinking about minstrel shows. Most people didn't know. But learning where something came from doesn't somehow ruin the memory. You just have more information now. And I think people are capable of doing that. You can, like Disney, and still talk about Disney history. You can think White Chicks is funny and understand why people don't view it the same way as Blackface. You can have grown-ups seeing Aunt Jemima in your kitchen and later learn why the character existed. None of that requires pretending your childhood was secretly evil. It means you're a mature adult now and you can look backwards with context you didn't have when you were a kid. And this is where I think Part 1 and Part 2 really connect. Part 1 was mostly about the systems. Housing discrimination, school and jobs. The way racism affected who had access to opportunity and who didn't. But those systems existed inside a culture. People needed ways to explain the inequality they saw around them. Entertainment helped give them those explanations. If you spent years seeing black people portrayed as lazy, then maybe you didn't ask why a black neighborhood has less wealth. If you've been taught they're naturally ignorant, Maybe you don't question why their schools have fewer resources. If your version of slavery is filled with smiling servants who love the white families they work for, maybe you didn't think it was very hard. Those ideas can survive even after the original character disappears. That's why I think racism laundering is such an important part of this. Sometimes the stereotypes survive longer than people's memory of where the stereotype came from. Jim Crow starts as a stage character, and that name eventually becomes attached to segregation. The mammy stereotype moves through American culture until a version of her is sitting on a syrup bottle. Minstrel performance influences the entertainment world that early American animation grows out of. A song references black life in Harlem, then that reference disappears from the version later generations remember. And after enough time passes, people see the later version and think that's where the story started. It usually isn't. So when somebody asks, why does everything have to be about race? I think that's sometimes the wrong question. Nobody went back in time and added race to these things. Thomas Rice named his character Jim Crow. Minstrel performers were deliberately intimidating black people. Aunt Jemima really does have roots in minstrel entertainment and the mammy stereotype. Disney really did release these cartoons during segregation. That's already part of the history. We're finding out about it later. And knowing that doesn't mean you need to walk around inspecting every cartoon character for secret racism. That's not the point of this video. I just think we should be curious about the things we inherit, especially the things that feel so normal that we've never thought to ask where they come from. Because sometimes you go backward far enough and the story looks completely different from the version you grew up with. And maybe that's the bigger question here. How much of this history did we actually leave behind? And how much of it did we just forget where it came from? If you enjoyed this video or learned something from it, I'd appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. I want to keep making videos like this where we can actually go back and look at where some of the things we take granted come from. And if you haven't watched part 1 yet, I'll have that linked here too. I'll see you in the next one.